Welcome back to another episode of Consciously Clueless. I'm your host, Carly, and here we break down complex issues around health, the climate crisis, and social justice through a vegan lens. We'll talk about the magic link between your well being and the planet's health because luckily, choosing a healthier, mindful lifestyle for yourself often creates healthier vibes for our planet too. Staying consciously clueless means getting to show up knowing nothing, but staying open to all that you can learn. From feasting on plant based meals and reducing waste to learning to meditate, every step you take contributes to your wellness and makes systematic change for the world. You can make a difference. This podcast will show you how. As I showed you when we were chatting, I got notes, I got questions, but let's start with what is your journey to veganism, and then we will branch out from there.
Yeah. So my journey to veganism actually is tied to many of the things that I suspect we're going to discuss today. I'm born and raised in the Midwest. I'm from Michigan, but my family, as most Black families in America, originated in the South. And my mom's family is from Mississippi, and my dad's family is from Louisiana. And so I grew up eating that kind of traditional Southern American, Southern Black diet, which consisted of the meat that we could afford to eat because we were pretty poor and we didn't have a
Mm-hmm.
ton of meat, but we ate meat and that was fine at the time in terms of just like my understanding of so much of my identity. And I think so much of all identities is tied into what we eat. It's a big part of how we understand and connect to our community. And coming to California for grad school was a big challenge for me because I was the first time I was leaving my family and moving pretty far away. And while it was necessary, I think for at the time I was married to my still now wife, it was necessary for us to grow into the next phase of our relationship. And I got a full ride scholarship to grad school, so that definitely made
That
it so
helps.
affordable to go. That was when I really began to get more into cooking and eating and thinking critically about food because I was lonely and I couldn't afford to come back home. And food was like a way for me to connect to my home. It made me connected to my community. And so while I was in grad school, I took a trip from LA to San Francisco and I was driving. And if you've ever been out here, for any of you who've been to this part of the country, when you're driving that road you take in Interstate 5 and you drive through what is now the most densely, it's where most of the produce in America is grown. Actually, like California
Mm.
is the largest industrial agricultural state in the country. It
Mm-hmm.
used to be Iowa for the longest time, but California has taken it over. And I saw all these migrant farm workers and just working in just like terrible conditions. Just it was hot. I saw at one time I saw the crop duster fly over them with all the chemicals and pesticides being sprayed on them while they're picking. And what it reminded me of was when we would travel from Michigan to Mississippi for family reunions when I was growing up and we would drive. And my grandpa, who's a pretty introverted person, would just come to life and would start telling stories about the times he would be working in the fields because he grew up as a
Wow.
migrant picker. So he was born in the 1930s and he would just talk about, oh, I worked in this field and I was in that field and we were picking this and that. And he would have all kinds of stories about growing up in Jim Crow South and the things he got into that luckily he's is still alive and didn't get arrested for, but also just the kind of the ways he was taken advantage of and
Mm.
how hard he had to work and I'm always amazed that he has this sense of gratitude, even now, not for what happened, but he's just like, it could have been worse. I think that's the way he always says it could have been worse. And we could talk more about why he says that later on. But there's a way in which now knowing more of his story, I'm like, oh no, it could have been worse. But so I'm driving to San Francisco. I see these people working. I remember my grandpa telling me their stories. And growing up, I just thought people didn't have to or were not exploited to grow food like that anymore. I just thought, oh, this is what happened. My grandpa had to do. It was terrible, but obviously that stopped. People don't do that anymore. And it just hit me that these people were experiencing the same kind of exploitation and dehumanization my grandfather experienced. And that's when I really started thinking critically about what I was going to eat and how I was going to eat and where it was going to
Mm.
come from. And so while I hadn't even made the conscious decision to stop eating animals, I made the conscious decision to begin to think critically about my food. And it was really in that, so this would have been the fall of 2010. And I began just, I have ADHD. And one of the benefits of this neurodiversity is a hyperfocus. And
Mhm.
I'm in grad school researching race. That's what I'm interested in. I'm researching race, racism, and I'm super interested in it. And then I'm like, oh, food and animals. It just shifted. And I just read everything I could find about this different kind of connections. And I realized that the part of the where I learned, I should say, among the reasons why my ancestors, my African ancestors, and these Latinx immigrants that are in the field working were being put through these kind of conditions is the ways in which white dominated society sees people of color as less than human. And this was the
Yeah.
justification for enslavement. This is justification for the kind of exploitation that people experience today. And and I didn't want to be complicit in it. Connecting the suffering of farm workers, and particularly industrial farm workers, and particularly when I learned about what happens inside industrial agriculture, factory farms, and the
Right.
fact that the people who have those jobs are mostly black and brown, and the way
Hmm.
they're treated, I just was like, I cannot be complicit in this exploitation. And so I always tell people, for me, my veganism is for the people. Like it was not, I love animals. I grew up
Hmm.
in the country. Animals are great. I got a dog. My wife's a veterinarian. I'm like, animals are great. But like, it's not, it is way more about so standing in solidarity with my community, the preservation and promotion of communities of color. And it's grown into other things now. But the genesis of it really is not wanting to be complicit in the oppression of people who look like me.
It's so interesting to hear how many different roads lead in, right? And
Yeah.
everyone has that thing that started the dominoes to fall. And I think it's interesting because you don't hear as often, or maybe it's just the population I've talked to, that it starts from people, right? It often you hear from, for myself, it was health. And then I was like, whoa, it's so much bigger than me. And the environment pulls people in and animals pull people in. But that connection to people, I feel like often comes later. And so it's interesting that was your inroad for all the other things to fall too.
I think growing up with and I write about my book is dedicated to my family. The way I frame my book is to tell the story of the one side of my family who were the farm workers, which is my grandfather, and that side of the family who were like the overseers, which is my father's side of the family who came immigrated from Spain.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
And I think for me, because my grandfather didn't speak a lot, when he did speak, I really paid attention, and his
Mm-hmm.
stories just really stuck with me. And I grew up in a community of like mutual accountability and solidarity. And I'm realizing now how unique that was, right? Like
Yep.
I didn't know when I was a kid, oh, this is really strange that I have friends that are all different races. We're just all poor. And so we support each other. Like my best friend's mother, Becky Gebhardt, like God rest her soul, was like my mom.
Mm-hmm.
We all grew up together. You know what I'm saying? Joe was over at our house or I was over at their house. That's just what it was. I wanted to make sure I lived in a way that would just not cause harm. And that was it. And it's already so stressful and it's so much work and it's so much challenge to live in America as a person of color. There's always other obstacles you have to face. And so for me to realize that, okay, I'm making it worse when my goal as an activist, as a theologian, as a person of faith is to do the opposite of that. It was just like, oh, okay, I need to shift. And it really gave me the moral imperative to do it pretty quickly and to try to find, for me, the challenge was trying to find ways to shift my diet that could allow me to maintain a sense of cultural identity.
Yeah,
Because my thinking about veganism, as you might suspect, was rooted in a lot of the way white people portrayed it, which was not
makes sense.
how I was like, I can't be vegan if I got to be vegan like that because that's not sustainable for me. So yeah, once I could work through that, then it became a bit easier.
Could you say a little bit more about that? I could be vegan, but I couldn't be vegan like that. What was it that you were not seeing represented that made you go, is this for me or not?
So a couple of things, and I'll start with a story to illustrate my point. When I was at the first church I was a pastor at was in Compton, so predominantly Black and Latinx community in California. Maybe familiar with it through music, as many people are. Kendrick Lamar from Compton, Snoop, Dre, all them folks. When I was working there, and the people at my church found out that this time I was vegetarian, like I was doing the work to figure out how I was going to shift. And they were like, "Oh, you don't eat meat," and they were like, "Oh, this." They didn't tease me or anything like that, but they asked a lot of questions. And then I found out as I was there, and I was talking to the black women in church. Many of them didn't eat meat, but they didn't identify themselves as vegetarian because for
Mm,
them, the term vegetarian was so steeped and rooted in a kind of sense of white privilege, they couldn't connect it to their identity, right? It was health, it was all these other reasons, but the label on it was a problem. And that was the beginning of me to realize how much these labels had been co-opted to a certain kind of performance-based
mm,
way of practicing that was more about what you project to the world rather than your own inner spirituality and inner well-being. And so for me, part of the challenge I had with connecting to that community or connecting to the labels within that community was it felt very much like it's about how other people see me and making myself stand out among everybody else and say, this is the thing. If you're not doing this, you're not doing all the other justice work doesn't matter. When as a black person, I'm like, it feels to me often that you're prioritizing animals
mm,
over me or over
mm-hmm,
my well-being. And again, when you're dealing with the historical ways in which black people have been animalized, that's it's not going to hit well. It's deeply uncomfortable. It's unsettling. And it feels as though you're more likely going to enable and allow racism and other forms of prejudice to continue because it doesn't matter to you, right? Because you're equating non-human animal pain with human pain. And that for me was just deeply problematic. And I can talk about why later on and then
mm-hmm.
I'll do the deep stuff too quick. But I was
No,
like,
please.
because I was like, I have to think of a new way to be vegan that represents taking both seriously the suffering of my community and the suffering of non-human nature. And so what I did in the spirit of soul food was to take the term from Af and Sil Co that they created called Black veganism, which
Mm,
really is a way of being vegan that's centered on like both decolonization from systems of oppression and humanization of life, right? Really just a respect for all life. And while we do something different with it, because they're not religious and I am, and in my conversations with them, I always say this, they're totally cool with me doing what I do. They're like, you add the Jesus to it, and that's fine. And that's literally what they said.
I
But
imagine you just sprinkling like the.
Sprinkle. It is still totally fine, but for me, it is rooted in my spirituality, and I would say it's definitely rooted in a spirituality for them as well. The majority of people of African descent in America are religious. Like we're statistically, the most religious people in the country, and so I knew if I was going to persuade my community to practice this way of eating, I had to incorporate it in religion as well, and it was just true to who I was. And so yeah, so for me, Black veganism is not so much about it's a kind of I guess the other word I would use a way of thinking about it is from the writer Bell Hooks. She talks
Mm.
about consciousness raising, when she's talking about feminist consciousness raising, how women get together and talk about the ways in which patriarchy oppresses them. And it was the same kind of way of thinking with respect to a consciousness raising about food as it relates to people of color.
And white feminism, right? There's some ties there, and how Bell Hooks was talking about that space and what you're talking about with white veganism.
It is, yes, 100%. I did the same thing with bell hooks. I was like, oh, I'm doing the exact same thing in terms of critiquing white veganism and saying you're not taking seriously
Yep.
these other realities. Like the people who are harmed, like the most people who live by factory farms are people of color. The people who work in these fields are people of color. The people who lands are being exploited and taken away from people of color. I'm like, all this stuff it can be about people and animals. Like these things aren't mutually exclusive. And I think seeing that interconnection should be a galvanizing force.
Mm.
And I think that's the thing for me that's persuasive. No, no, this really matters. But what it does for some people, it forces them to deal with their internalized bias that they haven't really wanted to work out.
And it causes some interesting questioning about what counts as community and who gets to show up in community and what does that actually look like, because we can say community all we want and it sounds lovely, but who is actually not only counted as community but who feels safe to show up there.
Yep. Yeah. And being safe and feeling safe are two different things. And by
Mm,
that, there's a way in which talking about the things I'm talking about now, and I hope people are listening to this podcast, you're not listening to it on twice speed or you haven't skipped over this section because talking about race can make certain groups of people, predominantly people of privileged white people, feel so uncomfortable. They feel as though they feel as though they're not safe. You know what I'm saying? Even though you are safe.
yeah, being uncomfortable is not unsafe.
Exactly. And I think it's sitting in that uncomfortability and turning inward and doing something and say, okay, why am I uncomfortable with this? What's coming up within me? And not to blame, shame, or judge that part of you, but to what I would say, and this is their spiritual religious part, to tend to that part with compassion and love, right? To treat it like you treat a friend. Like,
Mm.
why am I feeling this reactive to these conversations or the conversation about race or whatever, and meet that underlying need? And my experience is when you do that with people, when you help them do that work, they can grow. And that's been, yeah, I've had some really cool experiences with people learning about Black veganism, white people or people of other that aren't Black, and talking about what they're doing with the ideas of it because they're able to tend to their own internalized biases, and we all have them. Like I talk about, you can't be in America and grow up and not have internalized racism with respect to Black and Indigenous people because it's just everywhere. And sexism, quite honestly, dude, it's everywhere. And you're gonna have some of this stuff, and so it's just learning about it and unlearning about it really, and then replacing it with something else.
And when you have that privilege and you're confronted with these conversations, I try and talk to people because it feels uncomfortable, so you want to avoid it, right? You're
Yeah,
like, scroll or not read or skip this part of the podcast or whatever it is. But that actually causes more anxiety because that's that cognitive dissonance of, oh, I know I should be thinking about this thing, but I'm not doing it. And so something feels uncomfy. But for me, what is actually empowering is to have that knowledge and to go, this is systematic. This
yeah,
is so much bigger. This is not just me. I am a part of it and important and can do so much. But it's empowering to be like, oh, this is actually coming from these systems. And we're all feeling that
yep,
together in various ways.
yeah. The tricky thing about racism is that it is a trauma for all of us. It's traumatic for all of us because it has robbed us of a identity that humanity has historically had that's in some sense really connected to what we're talking about because it tied us to the land. It tied us
Yeah.
to our communities. And so for white people, for instance, for the idea of race to stick, you could no longer be English or Spanish or Portuguese or French or German. You had to be white, which means your identity was no longer tied to the land, to
Mm,
the space of your ancestors. That gave you a sense of belonging and an identity that was steeped in that soil that connected you to that community, to the ways you eat, to the ways you live, to how you hunt. All that stuff was tied to the land. And so when you remove that and tie it to your epidermis, right, to your flesh, a deep trauma, right? Because then the only way you can trust each other, relate to each other, is just through this idea of what you look like. And you and
mm.
I both know there's this, a lot of us are racially ambiguous. You don't know what people look like or what they are. And so it is a kind of trauma that we all carry. And tending to this trauma, and one of the ways I argue about tending to this trauma is to reconnect with the lands of our ancestors, to reconnect with our people and our communities as best as you can as a way of healing. So we're no longer drawn to the idea of race in a way of creating as a categorization. Rather, we're drawn to our communities, whether it be our communities of found family or our families or our ancestral communities. But it really broadens the idea of community beyond the kind of categories with which we've used to define ourselves against some other people.
And those categories and that pushing away from that identity is a tool of colonialism. It's by design,
Yeah,
correct?
it's very much by design. The system couldn't work. We're aware of that we have more in common than we are different, and to be in solidarity with each other. And this is the thing with colonialism is it's not only premised on race, but it's deeply premised on class. There's a reason why we have such economic disparity in this country. you have to have the idea that perhaps you can accumulate this much wealth. But when in fact, early American settlements, you had often communities of poor whites and blacks working together to resist the whoever owned most of the land, which is usually somebody from England, mostly
Mm-hmm.
England, landed gentry. And so for to create a permanent separation from those that kind of solidarity that had got built up, the idea of race was instilled. And so then you get this colonial framework and colonial mindset of delinking humanity, or I should say, linking humanity to certain ways of being in the world. To be a full human being is tied to race, gender, class, sexual orientation, and quite honestly, ability. And so that's how it works on an ideological standpoint. From an economic standpoint, it's essentially how can you exploit people? And
Mm-hmm.
basically where we get at. And so when you look at, again, talking about veganism, some of the ways in which we acquire certain foods from other countries. I'm sure there's so much research that's been done on quinoa in terms of how it impacts South American countries, right? This is again harming another community of color. And but if you see this as I have the right to extract that resource from these people because I'm paying them for it, even though I'm really not paying them what it's worth. Colonialism gives you the intellectual tools to justify that kind of exploitation as just a part of the capitalist system when in fact it just devalues life. It doesn't value life fundamentally. It just does not value life. It makes life into an object rather than a subject. And that is currently leading us to planetary collapse. But we need that. That's I don't want to get
Part two.
all doom and gloom. I was like, I don't know. I try to, as best as I can, try to lean into the hope because there's plenty of stuff out there that can be depressing.
And that justification is bolstered by the animalization of people of color. That justification becomes easier when you are thinking of people as less than in the same way that we do animals. And I know that's something you've talked about in some of your work. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that process and that tool.
The idea academically was first presented to me by this book, The Dreaded Comparison by Marjorie Spiegel. And it's a short book. And in that book, she has images of enslaved Black people, men and women, and animals that are enslaved. And just again, the tools of torture, the tools of control, it's the exact same. Like the it's the exact same, and it's the same reasoning that's used to enslave people. It's the same reasoning that's used to exploit animals. That these people don't feel that their value to us is as objects as and not subjects. It's that they're here to support us and not the other way around. And this idea, and unfortunately, this is where religion has done harm is this idea of dominion, this idea that this is our God-given right to have control over these kinds of over these people, over these not over non-human nature. And for me, reading that book really gave me a kind of piercing clarity as
Mm.
to how the language of the idea of the animal is a deeply racialized concept. And you hear it today. It's not just listen to the policing in the way they talk about who they're arresting and how just listen to the way people talk about immigrants. Like you still hear the ways in which people are referred to as animals, as it means
Mm-hmm.
to justify treating them like dehumanizing them or treating them or killing them or not valuing their life, basically. And so it's tied together. It's deeply tied together. And it has continued to be for me the found among the foundations of why I do the work that I do because I feel like when people are made aware of this, they start to pivot and they start to shift. And they're like, "Oh, I hadn't realized that was happening." And I'm like, "No, just listen to what they're saying. Like, why when you want to justify somebody being mistreated or say it's okay, why is it okay to call them an animal? What does that mean about what we think about animals? What does it mean when we think about people, right? What does that mean?"
Yeah, not only that link, but meat eating itself and what type of foods and what type of meat people were eating is linked to that colonial power and that history, correct?
Yeah. So there is this way in which within food studies you learn that the kinds of one of the ways they would argue certain groups of people were more sophisticated or less sophisticated is by their diet.
Mm.
And so I'm chuckling, even though it's not really funny because I'm just remembering some of the things that I've read.
And I went, if that's our judge now, then yikes.
There's this book by, I think his name is Jared Diamond. As I know his last name is Diamond, but his book is called Collapse.
Mm.
And he's talking about how Eric the Red was trying to create a colony in Greenland because he got kicked out of England because he was murdering people. It's actually
As
kind
one
of a
does.
crazy story, as one does. And so he goes to Greenland and you see the indigenous people there, and they're surviving eating fish. They're primarily a fish whaling people because it's iced over most of the time, and this is the way you can survive. But from where he's from, his culture is predominantly, I don't know if they came from England. I can't quite remember. It may be some other Scandinavian country, but regardless, their diet was primarily based on cows and pasture. And so they do all this work to bring in like chickens and pigs and cows and try to create these what we would call like a mega farm, a mega dairy in Greenland, so that he can get people from his native country to immigrate and live in Greenland. He's going to repopulate his land. And they're there for 50 years and they die eventually. They die out because rather than shifting and eating what the other indigenous people have been eating to how they survive, they were like, no, this is a heathen way of eating. It's heathenish to eat this. We have to eat like this is what civilized people eat. So people are willing to die because in their mind they're like
Wow.
this is what we do because they're so tied. And again, I use this as a way to talk about the challenge of shifting mindset to becoming vegan because I think it's helpful in as much as our identities are steeped in our bowls and our
Mm.
plates. And so asking people to give that up is like asking for a certain kind of death, right? And so for me, what I had to do, and part of the reason I think I continued to fall in love with cooking, is I had to figure out a way to eat in a way that was in alignment with my values and my cultural identity. And
Mm.
so I was like, how can I be black and vegan? How can I eat the things that I love in a way that's actually vegan? I can't eat the things I see these other people eating on TV because that's not even doesn't even look good to me. It doesn't taste good. It's not
Right.
what my people eat. And so it's through the work of people like Bryant Terry who gave me like some of the foundations that I need. And even Brian lives in Oakland, and so he and I talk, and like we eat differently because his people are from like different than my people, and so like his recipes often serve as a base for some of the things that I cook, and then my some of the things I cook, he's oh this is a really good take on what I did, and I'm not a chef. Brian is a chef. I may cook. He has been gracious enough to talk about my cooking, and he's complimented it, which makes me feel good. But when you eat with a chef or you hang out with a chef, I realize, oh, I'm definitely not a chef. Like their food looks pretty. Like mine just looks, it tastes good, but it's not,
How
you're
I
not,
feel. It ain't gonna look good, but it'll taste good.
it'll taste really good. It's not gonna look, it's not gonna be plated well, any of that stuff, but it's gonna taste good. So yeah, I didn't want to die to my community, you know? And so for me, one of the coolest things happened was when I was on my book tour after the pandemic, because the book came out during the pandemic. There was this lady from my father's hometown in Hammond, Louisiana. She came to one of my talks. I was at UC Irvine, and I saw this woman eating. And when I do my book talks, I always, if I can, which most of the time now I can ask people to do it. Each chapter of my book ends with a recipe, a vegan soul food recipe. And so I asked them to cook all the recipes in my book so people can eat while I'm talking because
Oh my
it
gosh.
connects my argument to what I'm making, right? And I finished my talk and I'm like, all right, any questions? This lady, old black lady, shoots her hands up. And I'm like, in my brain, I'm like, oh my gosh, this lady's gonna tell me that she's gonna tell me I'm wrong, like in all the
She's gonna
ways in
come for
which
you.
she's gonna come for me, and I can't say anything about it because I respect old people, and I'm definitely not. I'm just gonna be like, I'm probably gonna end up compromising my values because I don't want to make her mad.
You're like,
Uh,
never mind, this book sucks.
exactly. I'm just like, oh my gosh, man. And so but I noticed her while I was talking because she had all the food on the plate, like in separate cups, and I was like, that's a weird way to eat. And so she raised her hand and she says, hey, I'm from Hammond, Louisiana. I've read most of your book and I was drawn to it because you have people in Louisiana. And I put all your food in different containers 'cause I want to taste it individually. I didn't want it to blend together. And I was like, oh, and I'm gonna tell you, this tastes like home. And I was just like, yeah, that was how I felt. I about cried because it was like that for me is, and I write that in the end of, I think, chapter one. For me, red beans and rice taste like home. That reminds me of home. That's how I got to go back home and I had no money to go back home was through this food. And she was like, this tastes like home. She's like, this tastes like the food I grew up with. She's like, I can't believe that you made this and this is vegan and this is healthy. She was like, this is great. And it
Mm.
just, I honestly don't even remember everything after that kind of blacked out.
Yeah,
But
you're like,
I was like, in my brain, I was like, I have accomplished my goal. Literally, I was just thinking,
like I
yes,
can leave. I'm good.
like I'm done. I'm done. Everything is fine. Everything is
End of
good.
book tour.
And it was awesome. It was really awesome. And I feel like that is essential for people to finding their particular place and identity in this movement, to finding their voice, finding their people, and to being able to be themselves in the midst of trying to challenge um trying to challenge all these structures that make it hard if you want to take care of yourself, especially as a person of color.
I was first introduced to you in your work when you were doing a presentation with John Lewis or
Mm.
Badass Vegan and
Yeah.
Melanie Joy. And in that his film, They're Trying to Kill Us, which everyone watch this documentary, please. If you haven't, I've said this before, but watch it. Reminder to everyone, go watch this. But it is for me, who was not a part of that community, it made even more sense why it would be so hard to shift your way of thinking around food as a person of color with history of being able to make the food you were given the best it could be,
Yeah.
and which was not the best, right? It was the scraps. And so being very tied to we made this good food and we made this work, that makes sense why that would be an added layer to unravel and to make you hesitant to want to examine food because you're like, but we survived on this, literally.
Yeah. And I think that is a huge obstacle within the Black community because there's so much veneration and pride of the
Mm,
way in which the way we say it in my community is how our ancestors made a way out of no way. They knew how to make stuff that people wouldn't normally want to eat taste delicious. And what I argue in the book and what I talk a lot about doing is we need to continue to go through a process of collective healing from the trauma that was inflicted upon us with enslavement and agriculture. And so one of the things I talk about, and I was talking to John about this actually, was like, the reason that Black people were enslaved is because we were great, because we were great at farming. Like we were great, not just good, we were great. And so what you find is that depending on
mm,
what part of like where your ancestors are in America, if you're Black, that often coincides with what kind of crop was grown there, would also dictate what part of Africa you came from. So, as an example, if your Black ancestors are from the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, the likelihood is that your African ancestors are from the Senegambia region of Africa because that is where they grow a particular kind of rice that is also grown in the Carolinas. Carolina gold rice comes from Senegambia. And so they enslaved people who already knew how to grow that rice and could grow it well to teach people here how to grow it. And it's, again, this is where it's basic economics and capitalism. If you're going to enslave
yeah.
people, you want to get the people who know how to grow the thing. So if your people are from Texas, they're probably from the Fulani tribes. They're the herdsmen. If they're from Texas and Oklahoma, like they were people I read, and in my book, I think it's in chapter two where I have like first person documents, primary source documents of enslavers saying if you grow this crop, you want to buy someone from this tribe. If and you want and this tribe tends to sell these people during this time of year. They were very specific of what ports to go to get what specific kind of Black person to grow certain kinds of food. And I know the facial myth, it took me like that is maybe 10 pages of my book. It took me about 6 months to write. And normally I was cranking out pages so quickly, but I will read it and I have to stop because I'm like, how could somebody write this? Like, how could you write this down
It
and think this is okay?
like someone's fucking diary entry.
Yeah, yes, basically, yes. And it blew my mind. And so but what it did do, it shifted my framework to be like, oh, I shouldn't be ashamed of farming. I shouldn't be ashamed of agriculture. I shouldn't be ashamed of the way in which we learned how to cook because that's why they stole us. That's why they bought us. That's why we came here because we were excellent at this. We were often been taught that we were just like by we black people, we were taught that we were unintelligent people who were brought here and the white people taught us how to do everything when it was literally the exact opposite. Like we were enslaved, brought here, didn't know it was going to be perpetual enslavement. Like the people that often that sold us, the black folks that sold us, and for those of us who were that or those who were captured. And then we had the ecological and agricultural expertise that Europeans needed to survive in this country to be able to,
Indigenous folks.
just like indigenous people. And so it's and so once so for me, it was like I was like, I'm gonna reclaim our agricultural ancestry. I'm going to reclaim our
Mm.
culinary ancestry. So rather than I see enslavement as a part of the story, but not the totality of the story. And so I think the shift that I've tried to do with my community is to say, yes, we can honor our ancestors by recognizing these foods that we ate that helped us survive. But we had ancestors before enslavement. And those ancestors ate like this. They grew these kinds of things, and that's why they were enslaved. And for us, if we're talking about the spirituality of soul food, of what it really means to think about soul, it's always evolving. It's always evolved. We've never eaten the same things over and over forever. Like it's always had to shift depending on the circumstance for us to survive. And right now, for Black people to survive, this is where John and I are in very much alignment. Like that food's trying to kill us. And so we have to shift. If soul food is about the preservation and promotion of Black community, then soul food ought to shift to become more vegan, is the point that I make in the entire book. Is this is the food that our ancestors want us to eat now if we are going to survive. And it's totally in alignment with who we understand ourselves to be, if we understand ourselves to be a people that's concerned with the preservation and promotion of our community.
You've mentioned this a few times throughout our conversation, but your spirituality is informing a lot of the path you've taken, and you have a PhD in religion. So what is that doing for informing your understanding of veganism and your understanding of these conversations about race?
I think particularly with respect to veganism, it's probably no surprise as for any of your listeners who are practitioners of particularly contemplative traditions, so like Buddhism, Hinduism,
Mm.
even different forms of Islam. A lot of us are vegan or vegetarian, even if we don't talk about it. And I think this is within the Buddhist principle of ahimsa, just this valuing of life. And I think for me, it is a growing realization of our interconnectedness.
Mm.
And I began to think critically, and all this stuff was happening around the same time within this period of in my master's degree, the beginning of my PhD, this trip that I took. It's all within 2009 to 2011, like a couple of years where I had time to think, really is what I would say, and to be still enough to think about, okay, if I believe these things, for me as a Christian, if I read scripture in such a way that it's about liberation, that it's about community, it's about togetherness. It's arguing for what I would call an anti-oppressive worldview, right? People often think that Jesus was murdered for any number of reasons, oh, for salvation or for any other things. Jesus was murdered because within the Roman occupied Palestine, Jesus was saying, hey, we need not be worried about what the government Caesar is doing. We need to be talking about taking care of ourselves and supporting each other and being solidarity with each other. And this is how we find our humanity. And so he was promoting a religion that upset the Roman hierarchy. So he was executed based on it'd be like us putting somebody through capital punishment, same kind of thing. And so when
Right.
you recognize Jesus was oppressed, like like a colonized Jew who was oppressed by the Roman Empire, it changes how you think about that kind of message of solidarity, of love, of justice, of humanization, and compassion.
Sounds like you're reading a different book than some other people.
I know, and I wish it didn't sound like that, but you're right because people, when I tell, especially people from the Midwest, quite honestly, where I grew up.
Hit me.
Yeah, I'm like, yeah, Jesus was it was a colonized refugee under military occupation by Rome, that they're just like that's not the way they have ever read it. They haven't thought about it that way. They don't put Jesus in context of that circumstance because honestly, they've never had to think. They never thought about it that way. And that's to the fault of their leadership and as other and in any number of other circumstances in the ways in which the Bible has been used to promote a kind of white supremacy. I'm just really trying to unsettle that and be like, no, this is what it actually says. And people who read it in early Christianity knew that they because they were the ones who were oppressed and marginalized. So anyway, so for me, I guess the deeper point that I want to get to is I understand the call within the Christian tradition is to follow a spiritual path of radical compassion. That's
Mm.
really what I see ultimately the whole Christian narrative is teaching. And it's always more inclusive than we imagine it to be. Like it always includes more like that. Like even within the narrative of Jesus, like his disciples, other people, they were upset and frustrated by he's, oh no, we didn't include prostitutes, we include tax collectors, we include Gentiles. It's just and they're just like they want an exclusive kind of salvation. Jesus is like, no, it's liberation for everybody. And people, that is so counter to their understanding of kind of some of our innate selfishness that it's difficult for people, right? Because they can't, they're afraid to imagine it, I would argue. And I just try to just be honest and label it. I'm like, no, this is what it is. We are all that we are a part of, it's a oneness, is what I would describe it, like a collective oneness. And the sooner we see that, the sooner we recognize that and embrace it, I believe we can begin to do that kind of healing work. So yeah, it's deeply spiritual for me. Hopefully I answered
And I
that
think,
question. That was rambly. I apologize.
no, you did. And I think what it highlights for me, or it reminds me, is that Christianity and religion, as we see in the West, and from my own experience growing up a white girl in Minnesota, is so much more tied to colonialism and so much more tied to capitalism
Yeah.
than anything you just described. It is so clear that the because it felt like the conversations we were having earlier about colonialism and how Christianity is often viewed feel very similar to me than what you just shared in your worldview of it.
Yeah. And it has been co-opted in a way to justify the occupying powers of colonialism, of white supremacy, of patriarchy, especially. Like you look at the arguments that they are using right now to take away reproductive rights from women, right? Like it's so steeped in this kind of version of Christianity that they're using, that they're imposing upon people that honestly isn't even accurate to what the text says. But yeah, that's how they're using it. When in fact that runs counter to who the Jewish community has always been and who the kind of religion Jesus was trying to create. Like it is a religion of resistance, like of
Mm.
colonial forces. And unfortunately, within America, we've lost sight of that. Not all of us. There are many people who are resisting it. And I think, again, Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, these are people who were reading it the right way, yeah, I would say. And they were always shunned. They were always shunned. And because it's revolutionary, like it really is
Mm-hmm.
revolutionary.
Everything you're saying feels so counter to any understanding I've really ever had of what Christianity is. I'm one of those annoying people who says I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Um, but even just the way you describe that makes me so much more intrigued to learn because that is so counter to everything I was ever presented.
Yeah, I loved part of the reason I loved teaching religion at the in the undergraduate university. So I was a professor at the University of San Diego for 8 years, was because I had so many students who were like you, and they carried that kind of trauma, quite honestly, and not just Christian students, and Muslim students, Jewish students, many students from different religious traditions carried a particular kind of trauma from having religion, a kind of Christianity forced upon them that was exclusivist. And for them, that felt like if you're talking about God as a God of love, how can this God also hate these people? That doesn't make sense. And I was like, you're right. It doesn't
Yeah.
make sense. You're right. You're right. You know what I'm saying? You are right.
Yeah.
And what the choice, if I had to choose between believing in that God that hates people or not believing in God or being spiritual but not religious, I would make the same choice you made. But there is another way. And this is what I
Right.
always tell them. I was like, there is another way. And I would say the writings of, for any of your listeners who are interested, of Frank Rogers. He's Roman Catholic contemplative. His work in either his book called Practicing Compassion, and there's a version of it that's more specifically Christian, or Richard Rohr, who's another Roman Catholic. And Catholics have a history of contemplation in a way that often Protestants don't. So Lutherans are Protestant, in
Mm.
case you're curious about this stuff. They've kept that tradition, and I would consider myself mystic contemplative. Like that's to me feels more in alignment with how I understand my own spirituality. And so there are
Mm.
people out there who are trying to claim and reclaim a kind of Christianity, especially that is radically inclusive and one that is premised on compassion, which I think is more consistent. I think that's what Jesus was doing. I fundamentally think that's what I would boil down Christianity to. That's why I say it's a spiritual path of radical compassion.
Getting a PhD in religion, was that motivated by already having these thoughts around Christianity? Like, where did that impetus come from?
Credibility. And so I
Mm.
knew at this point, so after I got my master's degree, I'm already thinking, doing the work on race. I've added the animals and food part. And I know if I want people to take me seriously as a black man with dreadlocks, that I needed credentials. And again, not to toot my own horn again, but I got
Do
another
it.
scholarship. I actually got paid to get my PhD. Like,
Hell yeah.
my research was really, really regarded. And there are some organizations, Lilly among them. If you're familiar with the work that Lilly Foundation does, they paid for me to go to school and gave me a stipend so I could do my research. And they believed in the work that I was doing. And they gave me the confidence to believe in the work that I was doing. And I knew that I could begin to persuade and change and influence people if I had the kind of credibility that a PhD would confer. And not just black people, but people. Like I think one of the things that's been appealing about my work is I am just as comfortable and I've had fun times speaking at small liberal arts schools in the South where I'm the only black person in the room, and urban communities that are predominantly black. Because I
Yeah.
know it is be in a rural community and recognize that the large scale industrial agricultural system does not see you as a human being. They're trying to exploit your parents' land. They're trying to take advantage of you. I totally get that. And I see you. I see them. And I write about that in chapter 3 of my book. And so I think like just connecting with people's stories, to take it back to what I was saying in the beginning, man, it's just as much as I talk about race, what I realized again is that it's a collective trauma. And once I was able to get there, I'm like, oh no, I see why you're in these rural communities. They're so discriminated against. They're so discriminated. They don't have the public goods. They don't have the infrastructure put in place. And the people who are coming from those communities, they just lie to them. They appeal to their base desires in order to get their votes to not actually do the work to support those communities. And that drives me crazy because whenever it is I'm able to retire, Lord knows when that's going to be. That's where I'm live in the country. I know I am the most
Yeah.
country who lives in the giant city of Los Angeles, but I have a truck. I do all, you
Okay,
know,
Midwest, we see you.
that's what it is. I'm like, I know where I'm gonna be. Like when I have to work no more, like when we take a break and we travel, we stay in rural places because that's where I feel. And so I get it and try to connect with those people as well to tell the story in such a ways that can help us realize that again, it's mutual accountability. That's how we're gonna change the system.
In your classes, your theology and religious studies classes, are you bringing in veganism and race in these conversations? I have no doubts that you are, but maybe the question is, how are you bringing them in? Not if
Yeah.
you are or not.
I I am. And I would say in my ethics class especially, I had my ethics class, so I teach philosophical ethics, and I had probably about a 25% hit rate of students who would become at minimum vegetarian after taking that class.
Hit rate. Pretty
Because
good odds,
yeah,
honestly.
it was good. And I would say all of them significantly reduced their meat consumption because we did a section on eating animals and actually we would read Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals. And there's another book. So the University of San Diego is a Catholic school and it leans more towards the conservative side. It's not conservative, but it leans that way. And so we'll read Jonathan Safran Foer's book, and I would also tie it to this other book that talks about a Christian conservative framework for veganism that basically makes the argument that if you are pro-life, then you should be vegan. And it is a great
Whoa.
argument. It's a great argument. And I'll lay it out quickly. And so it's written by this gentleman by the name of Charlie Camosi, who's at Fordham University. And what Charlie writes is within the framework of Catholic Christianity, if you are going to be pro-life, there's nothing inherently that should make you limit the idea of what it constitutes life to human life. You need to also take seriously the reality of how these other forms of life impact the life of humans. And to be morally consistent, you need to also be vegan if you're going to be pro-life. And it's so good. I'm
Oh
telling you, Carl,
shit.
good. And so I would get because I would have students in there like, oh, I'm pro-life. I'm like, oh, and now I literally, if they say that at the beginning of class, I'd be like, I can't wait till we get to it.
Yeah, and you were like, make sure that's on the reading list.
Yeah, because I want to push them. Because what
Yeah.
happens is people want to drive that people want to adopt a morality where they can make excuses and opt out of it when it's convenient for them. And by this, if you want to be pro-life or if you want to have any kind of moral norm, you take it to its logical conclusion. So for me, if I want to be someone who's arguing for anti-oppression and liberation, it means I have to apply it to everything, not just
Mm.
some. And so if you're pro-life, you have to apply that to everything. You have to ride what's called the norm bus, is what I would tell my students. When you're on a bus route, the bus goes where it goes. You don't tell the bus where it goes. The bus has a route and it's going on that route, and that's what it is. You want to, I said, then this is metaphor doesn't really work as much anymore, but I would say now, I say you would take the norm taxi. You can say maybe say Uber. Where like you want to tell where you're going and you can get out. I'm like, that's not how norms and ethics work. You don't get to tell them, you don't get to opt out when it's inconvenient. If this is what you believe, it's what you believe. Otherwise, I would tell them they're being intellectually immature, which we have a lot of intellectually immature people that are in our elected office right now, unfortunately.
Heyo.
And no one wants to be intellectually immature. Really, I think most of us want to grow and we want to be confronted with that. And hopefully you give them a courageous space where you don't dehumanize them and you give them the framework. Because I wasn't teasing them or making them feel bad. I was
Right.
giving them the space to be like, okay, why do you think like this? What does it mean to you? And can you respond to the strongest counter argument to your position? And if you can't respond to the strongest counter argument to your position, but yet you want to hold to your position, that's a sign of intellectual immaturity. And is that who you want to be? And so yeah, I have quite a few students that would shift and change because I think because they began to realize that they were living lives that were inconsistent with who they were with respect to animals and also race. It was just I was a really highly respected, highly rated teacher. So I really loved it teaching undergrad.
You're making me miss education. I don't want to go back to school, but I just wish I could sit in.
I wish all teachers took the time to do the things that I did. Otherwise, I get it. I get it. I got several teaching awards. I did a lot of things like that because I
Mm.
love teachers for me is what, like, I didn't even realize I was smart until I was in high school. And I had one teacher is all it took that tell me that I was actually smart. And it changed my life. It was the beginning of a change where I was like, oh, I guess I am smart. I didn't know. And shout out to all the teachers out there, man, doing the work because it's hard. It's hard and it really do impact people. And so that's what I wanted to do too.
So you are constantly looking into these things. You are constantly looking at systems of oppression. You are studying them, you are dissecting them, you are living out these things. What are you doing to take care of yourself while and amongst? Oh, your face was like, shit, don't ask me that.
No, you totally asked me. It's been a challenge. What I do in ideal circumstances, I do but beyond eating to take care of myself is I love to run and I love to lift weights. At one point in my life, I used to be a really good athlete. Now I move my body and play sports and I'm still really competitive. Unfortunately, I'm just not very good anymore. So like I used to be really, I'm like, now, yeah, not so much. And so I do some of those things. Like I play softball, there's a soccer league out here, co-ed soccer league I play. And I'm about actually in 2 weeks, I'm be running a half marathon in Atlanta. It's actually called the Race. It's the first half marathon. It's really, I think, the only race in the country, only city street race that's really about promoting Black run culture, which is pretty cool.
Oh, wow.
And so I usually run about usually 3 to 4 half marathons a year
Damn.
because, and this is where I think maybe some people in your community can relate to it. Like this work is stressful and it's hard because you get frustrated that people aren't changing as quickly as you want them to, or other kind of things. And because of that, and because of other things like my blood pressure, I have really high blood pressure to the point where I have to take medication still for that. And that's because of that and stress and other things. And so that's when I started exercising and running. And I should do more to take care of myself, but I'm also a parent of a 5-year-old. And that was probably why my eyes went up, is I'm the parent of a neurodiverse 5-year-old that takes up a lot of
Mm-hmm.
time. And unfortunately, and there's a whole nother podcast, our country is not set up to support families like mine, even though we have tremendous resources, economic resources. It's a lot of work that my wife and I have to do to take care of Isaiah, to give him the support he needs. And he's a smart kid and he's a good kid, but he requires a lot of assistance right now just to stay in school and not get in trouble. So yeah, so no, I definitely am striving to continue to learn more about community care and leaning on other people and trying to take good care of myself.
So I meant to ask this earlier, but if you were going to point people, try this recipe first from
Oh, and
soul food, what
so
would
the
it be?
food and the recipe that you want to try is the red beans and rice. That
Mm.
is the recipe that's like the go-to recipe. That's the thing I make people who are nervous about eating vegan food. They're like, oh, I don't know. And they eat that and they're just like, oh no, this is good. So yeah, no, that's the recipe that I'm like, definitely eat that one first. It's pretty easy and it pulls people in because it is warm, especially if you live in the Midwest, man. Like when it starts getting cold, I'm like, yeah, but I eat it all year round. I love rice. I eat rice almost every day. But yeah, that's what I would recommend.
And it sounds like that's such a speaking to self-care is, like you said, cooking and nourishing yourself and cooking these recipes that are connecting you to something bigger. It sounds like it's a big part of your self-care.
It's a huge part of my self-care and my spirituality. It's the only
Mm,
way my son Isaiah, unfortunately, my grandmother died when I was young, and so he never had a chance to meet her. And it is the only way he knows his great grandmother is through making her collard greens. And so when he helps me cook, I tell stories about growing up. I talk to him about his great grandmother, and we have a picture of her in the kitchen, and I'm like, this is what she did, and this is who she was, and that allows him to have a sense of connection to her and connection to my grandfather. And and, and yeah, so it's a part of my spirituality, it's a part of my identity, and it's what I'm passing those stories on that preserved us to my son.
Is there anything that you want to share with listeners that I haven't given you space to do?
I think that the last thing I'll say is for those of you who are interested in learning more about my work, you can feel free to go to my website at drchristophercarter.com. If you're interested in learning more about this kind of Christianity or progressive Christianity that sounds like something you haven't heard before, if that's intriguing to you, the church that I currently lead is called The Loft, and you can find information on that at
Mm.
theloftla.org. My own podcast is called the Progressive Christians Podcast, where we talk about stuff like this. And we always tell people like we're the love your neighbor kind of Christians, not the storm the Capitol kind. So it is a bit, it's a bit different than what you might
It's
be
a very
expecting.
important distinction.
Very important distinction. But yeah, we
Yeah.
talk about politics and faith and pop culture because we're in LA and 20% of my church works in the industry. So much of my
Interesting.
community are people. It's like I actually never really watched that much TV till I took this job in LA because I have people
Yeah.
who are TV producers and that's what they want to talk about. And so I'm like, well, I gotta watch TV. So so yeah,
Interesting.
learn a little bit more about my work. And if you're interested in listening to that stuff, you can find me on social media, usually at Dr. Chris Carter or something like that. And yeah, if you got any questions or anything, just hit me up and I'm more than happy to chat and help people. And yeah, so thank you for having me on, Carly. You asked really good questions. So you did a great job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
If you're hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode of Consciously Clueless. And for that, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, tag me when you share in social media, or share this episode with others who may be interested in the topic. Any sharing truly means the world to me. Join the community at patreon.com/consciouslycarly for bonus podcast content like smoke sessions with Consciously Cannabis guests, video versions of solo episodes, monthly live calls, one-to-one support, more lifestyle content, mindfulness resources, and more. Until next time, stay consciously clueless.